The American aircraft manufacturer Boeing forecasts that African airlines will add over 1,200 new planes to their fleet in the 2 decades to 2044. Now, specifically, that figure includes the acquisition, of about 240 new aircraft to replace existing ones and the addition of nearly 1,000 others to expand existing fleet capacity. By their estimates, at least 70% of these new planes will be single-aisle jets, such as the 737, with wide-body jets like the 787 and 777 only making up 20% of forecast demand. Now, of course, the aviation industry is still dealing with extensive supply chain problems. In December, the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, pointed out that airframe production was outpacing engine production, and that's leaving 5,000 aircraft still in storage. In their words, that is one of the highest levels in history. Add in extra fuel, maintenance and engine leasing costs, and the supply chain crisis is estimated to cost airlines about $11 billion. Well, hours ago, CGTN's Ramanyang spoke to Shahab Malin from Boeing, and he started their conversation by explaining why most of the planes the African airlines would buy would be single-aisle jets.
One, it's the family of aircraft, especially from Boeing on the MAX, where it gives you a lot of potential from the low 150 seats up to well over 200 seats, and that gives the flexibility that's really required to help develop the networks in Africa. Beyond that, you see not as many of the super dense routes that you'd need that large wide body for, and so the ability to connect Africa is really the strength of the narrow bodies, and this is really in line with how the rest of the globe is as well. So the propensity for narrow bodies as a relative part of the overall CMO in Africa is very similar to what we see across the globe. So Africa is actually very representative of what we see globally. But because of that size, there's a lot of opportunities to, and because of the technology that's in the narrow bodies today, the range, the payload capabilities to connect city pairs efficiently and economically gives that flexibility that the African carriers need. And it's really the bulk of the network that they need to operate.
Because it is essentially a lot of point-to-point connection, but that don't necessarily have tons and tons of traffic, like a route between, for the sake of argument, Nairobi, Lagos, or Addis Ababa through to Togo, to Lome rather, in Togo. It's that sort of connection that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great examples. I think the other opportunity for the narrow body is not only to make those direct routes, but to bring in from a catchment area and then distribute. So if you're located in Central Africa or Eastern Africa, or even North Africa, connecting Europe, that one-stop traffic that allows a much broader reach, even with the narrow-body aircraft.
Yeah, pretty much like the model that we've seen Ethiopia employ with AirSky, for example, using that as an aggregator in Central and West Africa, bring traffic to Lome and then distribute that with wide bodies elsewhere. I want to focus on the financing side of it, though, because at least on the public sector side of the balance sheet, those have been fairly tightly constrained. Governments don't really have that much money available. So at least in the short term, how exactly would demand for these new aircraft be financed? Are we seeing a lot more demand coming into the lease market?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a lot more, but it's definitely, leasing has always been a major source of aircraft for the African continent, and we continue to see that, and we would expect to see that going forward for a couple of reasons. One, the finance piece that you already mentioned, and we have a Boeing customer finance team that works extraordinarily hard with our customers across Africa to find solutions for their aircraft needs. But beyond that, if you look at where Boeing and really all the OEMs are sold out to, the near-term availability, which is what a lot of African carriers are really needing today, is going to have to come through that leasing channel. So it's a great way for airlines to be able to get the aircraft they need, build their networks, and also get the aircraft sooner. So really that leasing channel is going to play a couple of roles in Africa as it does globally.
I want to loop back to something you mentioned a little earlier, supply chain constraints, because that's been a story that we've been hearing a lot about, especially from airlines. Last year, Kenya Airways, for example, had about 6 aircraft grounded in December. There was an interesting report from IATA where they were pointing out that if you combine the aggregate cost of all these supply chain bottlenecks that airlines are facing, it's around $11 billion in cost. And there's around 5,000 aircraft in storage at the moment, which is, according to them, one of the highest levels in history. Walk us through what the main pain points are, because I'm trying to juxtapose on one hand this interesting forecast for 1,200 aircraft over the next 20 years in Africa, but at the same time, at least in the short term, we're hearing airlines saying, look, we're finding it problematic to find the spare parts we need, especially on the engine side.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll let the engine OEMs discuss the challenges that they have, but as you mentioned, it's widely recognized that, again, across all the OEMs building aircraft, there are various supply chain constraints, especially as we try to go up in rate to meet demand. Those are things that are worked very diligently by teams. Sometimes we embed teams at the suppliers. In other cases, it's just a daily or regular conversation with them in terms of understanding where they're at, making sure that they understand where we see the markets going and the need, why they need to ramp up, so that they can convince their stakeholders that they need to invest in that ramp up as well. And working with new suppliers to see, what can we do to meet that additional demand. So it's just a continual piece of what we do at the Boeing Company, of working with our suppliers to do the best we can to make sure that we can meet not just new production, but also, that, like you said, spare parts and the things necessary to keep aircraft in the air.
Is it a combination of making it, or rather finding it difficult at the moment to get the inputs that you need, partly because of the overhang from the COVID-19 pandemic and the damage that did to supply chains, or is it more of a question of, we just don't have the people, the personnel, the talent that we need to get these aircraft off the assembly line as fast as we can?
I think, from the assembly and the final assembly at Boeing, we continue to watch we have 6 KPIs that we watch diligently, that we require to be in a certain place over a period of time in order to go back to the FAA and ensure that when we go up in rate, it's done in a very intentional way and safe way to maintain quality. So we have our arms around that pretty well in all cases as we look to ramp up people and employee proficiency and the jobs needed to make those aircraft is front and center in those KPIs. Beyond that, I think the supply chain probably it's variable, right? Depending on which supplier, if it's a material issue, if it's a people issue, it's a training issue, or it's some other issue. And it can just vary broadly across the supply chain. And that's why we have teams looking after individual suppliers as we do.